So welcome. So this is our first online session for the Summer Content Institute, Underrepresented Voices of the American Revolution. And so those who are joining us live, welcome. Those who will be viewing and listening to this session later on this summer, welcome. So I'm Gorman Lee. I'm the host and the instructor of record, and we have here Charlie Newhall, history teacher at St. John Preparatory High School in Danvers, Massachusetts.
And thank you, Gorman. Welcome, everybody.
And soon we'll also be joined with Bob Allison, our professor of history at Suffolk University in Boston. And then around 11:30, Kenneth Davis will be joining us live. And he's best known for his Don't Know Much About History series. Again, like I said, he'll be coming on here at around 11:30, and he's going to share his perspectives and insights on who controls the historical narrative of the American Revolution and American history in general, and how we as today's learners of history realize the importance of multiple perspectives and balance in our historical narrative. So that's our itinerary for today. So this is our fourth Summer Content Institute. And this year, this is the first time that we're actually doing this hybrid approach, combining online sessions and face-to-face sessions. So in July, we're doing 4 online sessions live every Wednesday, starting today. And then in August, we will meet together visiting various places and sites around Boston in August. So these sessions are recorded live, but not all of our workshop sessions are live. We have a couple of pre-recorded interviews and conversations. And so it's a new thing for me to try to coordinate these sessions in a coherent manner. But for instance, today we were supposed to have Ray Raphael to join us. He lives out in California, and he's actually going to be at a place where he isn't able to connect live. So that's why we had to schedule a day and time earlier. Actually, we met last week on July 2nd, and we had our conversation and we recorded it, and now I've posted it on a private YouTube channel that's only accessible to participants. So yeah, so it's a learning experience, trying to put this all together. And but for those,
let me just jump in and say, Gorman, you do a tremendously wonderful job of bringing together lots and lots of voices, and I'm really excited about all the different people we're going to have involved in the online version of this to really enhance things, so that by the time we get together in August, we're really going to be coming in with great knowledge and awareness and lots of good questions. And so thank you for all the work you've done already in making this Zoom course part of our course terrific.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, it's an interesting process. It really is. But I guess this is what the future is like, right? With professional development learning. The demands for teachers is very, very high, and it can be very crazy, and the traditional model of professional development where you come in and you meet people. I mean, that it's still a great experience, but we need to also kind of figure out another ways to learn content and be sharing practices in other means. And this is just one of many means. Um, so it's interesting. I think there's a
Well,
lot
one
of
of the things I really like about well, I was just going to say one of the things I really like about this is the idea that we're bringing teachers together who are and others who are excited about this content and learning this content, but and delivering it for how they're going to teach it and be interactive with their students. But also we're bringing in scholars and public historians and people who are actively working so that people will walk away from this hopefully with a state of the field sense and a confidence, which is a lot of what I think we've done in the last 2 summers, 3 summers, and what Mass Council tries to do with its conferences, what the New England History Teachers Association has tried to do with our conferences over the years. Teachers are teacher historians and students are student historians. And how do we make that alive for them by introducing them to some of the latest and greatest thinking, but also some of the really tried and true. And that this is a venue to do that.
Yeah. And also, this Zoom software, there's a free version, that you can set up your own schedule meetings such as this. I paid for this session because the free version of this actually is only gives you about a 1 hour time limit to do these meetings, but the paid version you can have it as long as you want. But the one nice thing about just for teachers having this type of program, you can bring scholars in your classroom. I think was it last year? I had John Tinker.
Yeah, 2 years ago. Yeah.
No,
was it?
Yeah.
You're in your class.
Yeah. And so he was able to speak with students about his role and his experience in moving the case to the Supreme Court, and so yeah, it was interesting. So or you can if you knew of another teacher, let's say from across the country, and you can have a debate, with your classes, with a different classroom in a different school, or again having like what we have, scholars. I might be able to ask Ken Davis to speak to our students through this medium. So it's kind of interesting, and then you can record this session, which is what I'm doing right now. So other teacher participants who couldn't join us live is still being able to watch this and be able to at least gain content knowledge through this session. But of course,
you can archive this, and it can be searchable sometime in the future at archive.org or one of those places. And next, we're gonna all be all of the people in this will be famous.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so this is it. So this is new for us, and hopefully, I'm sure next year will get better, and the year after that will get better, and then of course there's something totally new. Maybe we'll have holograms, and we'll be able to do more fascinating things with this. So anyways, hello, welcome, Bob. How are you?
Hi, Gorman. Hello, Charlie.
Hey, Bob.
Hello.
Hello. All right, let's see. So there's also a chat feature on this Zoom meeting, and you should see a control panel on the bottom of your screen. One should say chat. If you click on the chat, a chat discussion board shows up. I already posted a link that takes you to our itinerary for today. And
I think we have Meryl Kohlhofer has joined us.
Oh, hello. Hi.
Hello. Meryl. Hey, Meryl.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hi, Charlie. Bob.
You're welcome. So, so the chat discussion on the board it should appear on the right side of the screen. There should be a link that takes you to our itinerary, and it also gives you some short descriptions of some of the things that we'll be talking about. And so that's our itinerary for the day, and I'll have one for each week for the rest of this month. So today is really more of an overview of underrepresented voices. Who are the underrepresented voices? Who writes the narrative of the American Revolution and American history in general? So why don't we just start with just focusing on the first session, thinking about what the framers were thinking. And I've asked Bob Allison to maybe just provide a brief or short presentation or conversation about this, and so why don't we begin?
Okay. Well, I would like this to be more of a discussion, since I tend to start a monologue, and I want to avoid that. But I think one thing to remember, well, there are a lot of things to remember, so I'm trying to stop using the phrase "one thing to remember." We live in a different world, and the past is different. So we do need to stop our assumptions that the past was pretty much like today, only people wore different clothes and talked funny. The framers had different questions they were asking, different problems they were trying to solve than we do. That's just one thing to bear in mind as we're considering this whole subject. And we know now, because of the way scholars have been investigating this over the last, half century or so, that the world at the time of the revolution was different from the world of today. That's obvious, and I think I just said that, and I'll probably keep repeating that since it seems to be the one thing I know today. But secondly, okay, just use an example. In March of 1770, a group of British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston. They killed 5 people, wounded half a dozen others. One of the people they shot was an African-American Nipmuc named Crispus Attucks. 2 of the witnesses in this large crowd were Newton Prince, who was a free African-American pastry chef, and Oliver Wendell, who was enslaved to Andrew, who was enslaved to Wendell, a lawyer in Boston. So think about this. You have a crowd in Boston. British troops, 7 soldiers fire their guns, and one person they hit is a person of color. 2 of the witnesses, at least, are people of color. This is a presence here. And in fact, the African-American population of the American colonies as a percentage of the overall population was higher than it is today, or higher than it has been at any time since. That's just one thing to keep in mind. Second thing to keep in mind is that the framers, and I was asked to talk about what the framers were thinking, knew a lot more about Native Americans than we do. One of the reasons for the Albany Conference of 1754 was to shore up the relationship between the American colonies and the Iroquois. The Iroquois, who were really critical to the survival of the American colonies in the Northeast. And at the same time, one of the reasons South Carolina and Georgia are most interested, they are leery of breaking with the British Crown, is because of the large number of enslaved people the whites in those 2 colonies had under their control. And knowing that if there was a rift among the white leadership, then there would be an opportunity for a slave rebellion. But on the other hand, one of the real threats they had were the Creek and the Cherokee on their borders, and a need to establish better relationships with the Creek and the Cherokee and prevent a war on the frontier. Native people were very much on the minds of the framers at any point during the Revolutionary period. They weren't distant group. somewhere out in Wyoming. They were people right here. And so you have these real presences here in these colonies on the coast. And it's not simply the Samuel Adams, John funny hats and knee stockings talking about things, but this is really a world in which there are people of color and also an engagement with the rest of the world. You know, Boston's whole economy depended on trade with the West Indies and producing, sending codfish to feed the slave labor force in the West Indies. So you have these folks here, not necessarily, okay, so I know I'm simply rambling, so I welcome any of my more learned colleagues jumping in with a question. But you also have one of the most extraordinary things about the revolution is a time when everyone has to ask what side they are on. And it's not just these guys like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, about whom we know a whole lot, but everyone associated with them, apprentices, African Americans, Native Americans, women who don't necessarily think of themselves as members of that group. I think this is another relatively new thing in our society. By relatively, I mean anything over the last 100 years, that people identifying as a group rather than as part of a civil body politic that will include lots of folks. So it's a dynamic world as well. And so one thing historians have been doing over the last 30 or 40 years is recovering the different pieces of this world. The presence of African Americans, the importance of Native Americans, the roles of women, and then how the revolution impacts different members of society, like children. And we know also that the revolution was much more of a civil war than it was simply a revolution. As I said, people are making this choice about what side they are on. And this means that families are being divided. And divided over this fundamental question of how you will be governed. And the choice you make is then going to impact the course of your life and the course of your relationship with parents, with children, with spouses. And so the world, as we get into it, becomes much more complicated and much more interesting, because we do have individuals making these choices. And sometimes it's based on the kind of socio-economic, demographic factors we can understand, and sometimes it's not. Just as most choices people make don't have any real basis, many times don't have a basis in rational thought, unless you're Charlie Newhall or makes these choices for the best of all possible reasons. Okay, so this is kind of a long prelude to things. That is, what we're hoping to do in the course of these conversations we're having is rethink the way we can teach this, knowing it's a complicated, muddled world. And Gorman has managed to bring in some of the most extraordinary scholars who have been working on this. So the conversation we had with Ray Raphael, who's written The People's History of the American Revolution, as well as a great book about 1774, which he sees as the real beginning. And Gary Nash, with whom you're in the process of creating a conversation, is really one of the pioneers in this. And Holly Brewer has done tremendous work on Native people, on women and children in the time of the Revolution. And hopefully we'll get Darius Coombs to weigh in on this. And Cherno Sase has written a great biography of Prince Hall, who founds a Masonic order in the 1770s in Boston. His son becomes one of the founders of the Free School for African Americans in the 1790s. And Prince Hall, of course, is the namesake for the Prince Hall Lodge. And so Cherno has written like the one real biography of the essential figure of all of this. So you've managed to bring in these folks who have done the real work of bringing this stuff to the attention of a wider audience. So our real goal is to think, how can we get this into the curriculum? How can we get this into classrooms? How can we make this part of the narrative so that we as teachers aren't just retelling the same story everyone knows, which if it's been told enough, eyes start to glaze over, I'm told, at the mention of the Stamp Act or other things. And so that's really, I think, what we're about with these conversations, is rethinking the narrative and how can we get this into a broader conversation. And some teachers are already doing this. And Ray Raphael in his conversation showed us this great resource he has created in using classrooms to have real debates about particular episodes. I know Charlie's classes have done real work on this as well. So that's really our task as historians. Think, okay, so we kind of know this, and we know about all these roles. This should be more than just the sidebar. This really should be the essential story. Because it's a story about people making choices the same way our students are making choices. And their students today making choices and will be over the next generation about the world in which they live, just as these folks in the 1770s were making choices about the world in which they lived and the world they understood. Just getting back to that general question, what the framers were thinking, I think they did have some specific, some kind of general principles they were trying to live by. And you see that, was there a question coming up? No. Stop me if there's a question. Raise your hand, jump up, shut off the microphone, do whatever you can. If there were bumper stickers in the 1770s, you would have seen a lot of them, all men would be tyrants if they could. That was kind of the fundamental idea that I think motivates us, this idea that tyranny is something that in people, all human beings, have a tendency toward. And so the real goal of the revolution is to prevent that from happening, not by creating a better class of people, but by limiting the damage people can do, by creating a system of government that will mitigate it. So that's, as I see it, the big story of the revolution. And then the work we're doing is to put back into it all of the individual to make it happen.
Bob, I want to jump in. I love that you use that phrase, all men will be tyrants if they could. And I think Abigail Adams uses essentially that same line.
Yes.
In her letter. And in going back and looking at all the different groups you're identifying, you're really talking about a very different historical picture of Boston in 1770 or the colonies on the cusp of the revolution than perhaps maybe we are presenting, or some of us have learned in the past, a much more, as you say, dynamic, but also much more complicated understanding of who were in the population. Not only, obviously, men and women, but also the Indians and their relationship with the founders and with people on the frontier, and what happens in Pontiac's Rebellion and how that will impact things if we go back to the 1760s. And what is the relationship between the West Indies and New England, for example? All of that changes the groundwork, if you will, that sets the stage for the revolution. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm hearing in what you're saying. And that leads to a different understanding of the choices that people are making, or at least a different group of people making choices, which impacts the outcome. So with that, in part, what we're saying is you can't see the revolution the same way once you see the groundwork or the frame in a different way. Is that accurate?
That's very well put, Charlie. I wish you had started off.
No, you did great.
Yeah. By the way, that phrase, all men would be tyrants if they could, Abigail uses it. By the way, I suspect you know where it comes from.
Yes.
Okay, good.
I think it comes from the Remember the Lady's letter.
Well, that's where she uses it. Yeah. But actually it was around much longer than that.
No.
Okay. I have my classes try to guess. Who do you think said this? And you get all kinds of, from John Locke, Montesquieu, Karl Marx. Yeah. It comes from I'll tell you the first time I came across this was in a book published in Vermont in the 1790s. It was a biography of the Prophet Muhammad, and it was published. The book, and this was just a little squib at the beginning, okay? And this biography of the Prophet Muhammad was written in the 1690s by an English clergyman who was worried about the rising infidelity in England that was going to lead to all kinds of bad things. And the big bad thing that comes out of the biography of the Prophet Muhammad is there are these kind of secular, all kinds of religious turmoil in Mecca that was resolved when Muhammad and his followers come in and establish this reign of religious purity. And so it's not a favorable portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad. But Muhammad is really, I don't know how we got onto the Prophet Muhammad in 18th century representations of him, but the guy who publishes this book, the book is published in the 1690s. Why is it being published in Vermont in the 1790s? Well, the publisher was a fellow named James Lyons. His father was Matthew Lyons, the congressman, who at the time Lyons was publishing this book was in jail for violating the Sedition Act. So he has his little squib, all men would be tyrants if they could. Right, and who's president now? John Adams, one of the leaders of the revolution. And now we have this reign of the witches here. And what's going to happen is religious is tyranny the way Muhammad established it. So anyway, but yeah, James Lyons did not coin the phrase either. We know Abigail Adams used it. And it wasn't in the 1690s book. Humphrey Credo was the English clergyman who wrote that biography of Muhammad. But it was published, the phrase is coined around that time by Daniel Defoe, who is an English writer. And no, it's not in Robinson Crusoe or Moll Flanders. It's in a pamphlet Defoe wrote in 1704 about the Kentish petition. A group of folks in Kent, England, petitioned Parliament. This is in around 1700 or so. And remember, Parliament is the great body that brings liberty to the English people against monarchical tyranny. Parliament is this great liberty-loving body. And even Americans kind of like Parliament too. They saw Parliament potentially as their ally until in the 1760s and 70s, Parliament isn't. So these folks in Kent petitioned Parliament because they don't like something Parliament has done. And Parliament responds by charging them all with treason, arresting them, throwing them to jail. It's here because they complained about Parliament. Parliament says you can't criticize us, we're Parliament, and throws them in jail. And so Defoe's pamphlet is really an attack on this, and it has this little poem at the beginning. Nature has formed this tincture in the blood. All men would be tyrants if they could. Not kings alone, nor ecclesiastic pride, but parliaments, and every man besides. So tyranny isn't just something that the king or religious prelates can wield, but parliaments can as well. So what does this mean? It means you really have to be careful how power is created. And in that letter, Abigail writes the letter that gets all of the real credit here. All men would be tyrants if they could. Remember the Her husband's response is really quite extraordinary. He talks about all these different people whom the British ministry have whipped up in opposition to their pursuit of liberty. Stock jobbers, Scotch, Irish, Negroes, just about every group, Baptists, Quakers, and all of these folks. And now he said yet another tribe has been brought in, a much more dangerous one, that is the women. He said, but I know that we have more sense than to repeal our masculine systems, and he hopes General Washington will take a stand against this. Abigail doesn't think this is very funny. She writes an angry letter to Mercy Otis Warren saying she can't believe what he said in response to my letter. But anyway, so that's where that comes from. Daniel Defoe, Kentish petition, all men would be tyrants if they could, something good to remember. And I suppose any of these other folks we've been talking about conceivably could. Because that's another thing the framers have very much in mind. As I said, we tend to think about these groups, but these folks didn't necessarily. They'd notice differences and things, but they're looking at a community made up of lots of individuals, and individuals who held different stations in society. And this goes back to, I guess, time immemorial, but the Puritans also had this belief in a social hierarchy, which had eroded in New England because the hierarchy is not necessarily based on wealth, but based on something else. And so you have this world in which everyone is a part and everyone does play a role. Another really essential thing to remember about this society, in a place like Boston, people do live in a very small area. and know each other. And people do have connections with folks in the hinterland. And so it's not as though something that happens in Marblehead or in Springfield is not known by folks in Boston. One of the things that happens is the creation of a communications network that allows word to spread. So you have a dynamic world, and also a world very much in touch with other people in it. I'm not sure if I answered any of your questions, Charlie, or if I just started talking.
No, absolutely. I think the understanding how that dynamic world set the stage is what I was trying to drive at, and you've given it much more rich complexity. And my goodness, who knew about Daniel Defoe? I certainly did not know about that particular poem by Daniel Defoe, and to think about that Kentish moment, right? That petition, and how that as a precursor in some ways, right, to how the tensions and what is the real role of a legislative government.
Yeah, exactly.
It's perfect.
Yeah. So other things just to keep in mind. None of this happens in a vacuum. And these, Gorman, were you asking a question or was it?
Oh.
Okay. So they are seeing this world in which they live, and and they are cognizant of suddenly, Mr. Kilhopper, you loom large on my screen. Do you have a question? Or
Actually, I was just muting my mic because there's a fire truck going by outside. But it wasn't much question. One of the things that both you and Charlie were just talking about that struck me is this, as you said, this very complex world. One of the things I've been fascinated about is all of these individual decisions that are being made. You have not just the petitions of the legislature to Parliament, but say the petition of enslaved and free African Americans to General Gage and the Assembly that Newton Prince is lobbying for.
Yes.
And at the same time, in 1774, Abigail Adams writes the letter about there has recently been a conspiracy of Negroes in the town, that they, for which I found no evidence that there was ever any such conspiracy.
Yeah.
But it's like a conspiracy theories are happening.
Yeah.
So that orderly society is also kind of breaking down.
Yeah.
As you said, with John Adams' response to Abigail's later letter.
No, that's very true. That you have this. I kind of am skeptical that society has ever really been orderly. I think we kind of envision it. So I see what you're saying, and this does suddenly. This is why Samuel Johnson asks that great rhetorical question: how is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? And you have all of these folks gassing on about liberty, and yet, as Johnson points out, there are no slaves in England, but there are lots of slaves in America. So how come the Americans keep talking about liberty? And that petition you mentioned, that in the 1770 petition, you mentioned, we expect great things from men who have made such a stand in defense of liberty. They write to the Massachusetts Assembly, which promptly ignores them. Now, the Assembly in 1773, I think they are happy to turn on Thomas Hutchinson, because they have these petitions from people saying, hey, yeah, well, you're right. And also, the British Crown has told them that they have to do better by the Mashpee Wampanoag. The town of Mashpee had been set up as a town for the native people. And then promptly the folks in Barnstable start cutting timber there and saying, well, why do the Indians have this land? And the Mashpee protest to the king, who sides with them against their neighbors on the Cape. And this is an issue that comes before the Assembly in 1773 as Thomas Hutchinson gets the word from the Crown that you have to take better care of the ministry. You can't take their land. You can't cut their trees. And so fortunately, they then can turn on Hutchinson for a variety of other reasons in 1774 and drive him out. Yeah, but yeah, it's a complicated world. And you have, yeah, the Assembly is not necessarily the, well, they're politicians looking for an advantage and using this. But yeah, they guess on about liberty, and it raises this big question: did they really mean this? And I think we look at the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Say, well, what does that actually mean? Endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, how can they say that if they know that 20% of the people are actually enslaved? And, well, that's a complicated question. What did they mean? And sometimes we say, well, it didn't really mean they meant all white men, which I don't believe is true. And I also don't necessarily believe that men would use simply in the gendered way. It might have been, but here's the thing: in Virginia, in June of 1776, at the same time that the Congress is writing the Declaration, and by the way, Jefferson, who is on this committee writing this, is really mad that he's not in Richmond writing the Constitution for Virginia, because he knows that's the important thing. And Jefferson never gets tired of writing draft constitutions for Virginia. But it's George Mason who then writes the Virginia Constitution, and the Constitution begins with a Declaration of Rights. This is why you have a government, as the Declaration says. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So the Virginians are drawing up a Constitution. It begins with a Declaration. In Article 1, that all men are born free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights of which they cannot be divested, or which they cannot divest themselves. And this is strikingly similar to what the Declaration says, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you have this, it may be century boilerplate, all men are created equal. Do we really mean this? Well, the Virginia Convention says we can't actually say that. All men are created equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights which they cannot be divested. We can't say that because 40% of the people in Virginia actually have been divested of their rights. So they change it. They have this qualifier. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot divest themselves of their posterity. So it creates this plausible fiction that the people we hold as slaves actually, at some point, had been in a state of society, and at that point, they had divested themselves in their posterity of these natural, essential, and inalienable rights. It makes it somewhat more complicated, and you think, boy, they really put that one off. The thing they don't do is say, all white men have these rights, or all of us have these rights of which we can divest others. But they say somehow these people have been divested of their rights. And in Massachusetts in 1780, when John Adams drafts the Constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution has a very similar opening paragraph. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights of which they cannot be divested. And then it goes on to say what these rights are: to own property, sue and be sued, etc. But they don't change it. And that's the reason why in 1782 and 83, Quock Walker and Elizabeth Freeman can bring suit against their owners for holding them as slaves, because the Massachusetts Constitution says that they have these certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights. And Judge Cushing, I always ask my students, so how do you think the Massachusetts courts are going to rule on this one? Does this mean all men have these certain rights, or do people hold the slaves? And invariably it seems to say, oh yeah, it just meant all white men. Well then, In the case of Quock Walker, Judge Cushing looks to by the way, it's not the judge giving an edict from on high. It's in his instructions to the jury, where he says that the Constitution seems to indicate that the people of Massachusetts have a different idea about this than prevailed earlier. So he's instructing the jury. And so the jury does find that Nathaniel Jennison cannot, in fact, own Quock Walker because Quock Walker has these certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights. And the follow-up case of Elizabeth Freeman or Mumbet has a very similar outcome in the Berkshires. And Nathaniel Jennison petitions the assembly to get paid, and maybe they should have a compensated emancipation, which the legislature doesn't take up. But you think about this. In Virginia, they do add this clause when they enter into a state of society. But had they not, you would have seen possibly freedom suits in Virginia in the 1780s. As there were, the Methodists come to Virginia and try to introduce petitions against slavery in the 1780s unsuccessfully. And in the 1787 and 1788, there's a big debate over adopting the Constitution, and the federal Constitution. And one of the big criticisms of the federal Constitution is there is no Bill of Rights. And at the South Carolina ratifying convention, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, a supporter of the Constitution without a Bill of Rights, says, most bills of rights begin with a declaration that all men are created equal. We would make such a declaration with a very ill grace, since most of our people are actually born slaves. So you have these guys living in a world where no, all men are created equal means it's a world in which many people are born slaves. So how are they trying to reconcile this? And then what does this mean to the people who are born slaves when they read this? Either these people are glaring hypocrites. This is what David Walker takes out of it in the 1829, 1830, or this is something that they genuinely mean. And it is that. Is this something they genuinely mean? They keep coming back to haunt us. Is it something we genuinely mean? In the 1857, the Supreme Court pretty much throws out that interpretation. Lincoln and the Republicans hold on to it. One of Lincoln's great letters to his friend Joshua Speed talks about how we started off as a nation with the declaration that all men are created equal. Now he says, this is in the 1850s, we make this read, all men are created equal except Negroes. And if the know-nothings ever take power, it will say all men are created equal to Negroes and Catholics. So when that day comes, he says, I will emigrate to some place like Russia, where I can have my despotism pure without the taint of hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bill,
Go ahead, Charlie.
No, you, Merrill, go.
Yeah, I was just coming. A more local comment about that with William Wells Brown, in I think it's 1842 or 1843, wrote that if Boston was ever the cradle of liberty, the child has been rocked to death.
That's good.
I just wanted to say, Bob, that was a tour de force history from the Revolution to the Civil War. Punctuating, what is the meaning of liberty, and what do they genuinely mean, and how to see how that transpired, and how people came back and tried to interpret it different ways. And today, as we grapple with these same words in the classroom with our students to try to understand what they meant in 1775 or 1776, we bring a different sensibility to it as well.
Yeah, we do. And it raises questions, doesn't answer everything. A couple of years ago, I was invited to go give a talk in Armenia. And there's a college there. Every year they focus on some seminal text. And this year it happened to be the Declaration. And what really, but I was happy not to have to talk about equality, but the thing they took out of it was the pursuit of happiness. And somehow they interpreted this to mean everyone in America is happy and is actually entitled by the government to their happiness. And they were just imagining this blissful world we live in. And I have to tell this one young woman who asked me this with a big smile on her face, and she had to wipe that smile off her face, and no one's guaranteed happiness. In fact, yeah, we can pursue it. So I don't know. I don't know if the pursuit of happiness comes up in your classes as something that I was happy to. Well, no, I wasn't happy to. It's my role as an historian to wipe out happiness wherever I find it. You know what H.L. Mencken said about the Puritans, that it's someone with a sneaking suspicion that someone somewhere might be having a good time.
Well, and I think that the term happiness had a very particular meaning in the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Which I think most students, when we start talking about that phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they know life, liberty, and property. They, of course, have heard life, liberty, and happiness, and they're curious about that. Well, yeah. So we have a right to be happy. What does that mean? But again, unpacking it in an 18th century context helps them begin to see how much difference there is, what the space is between us and 1776.
It is a different world. In some ways, though, you know, as Faulkner said, the past isn't, you know, the past, it's not even the past. The past is different, you know, so it's here. Yeah, but other ways things are different. We have to try to understand them and also understand what they mean today. So this is one of the most important, interesting periods in the history of the world for creating creating governments. And we tend to look at the federal constitution as the thing, when in fact they're really looking at states as the real places to do this. Well, they're going to create a fundamental law. And among the first to do this is Pennsylvania. It creates a very radical constitution. In Gary Nash's book, well, he's written a lot about the Pennsylvania Constitution, which is very democratic. It's really modeled in many ways on what Thomas Paine says in Common Sense. And Paine and others see the real problem we've had has been the British monarch and the aristocracy. And they looked at these state governments that had emerged by the time of the Revolution as having evolved from that idea of a monarch and an aristocracy and a common people represented in different places. I think not the way these colonial charters have been designed. They were designed not to be mini examples of the British government, but instead to be like a corporate entity like the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And Pennsylvania says, okay, what we'll do is get rid of the executive. And in Pennsylvania, the executive really had represented the Penn family. In fact, Benjamin Franklin and James Joseph Galloway in the 1750s pushed to have Pennsylvania become a royal colony instead of a proprietary colony. I know Charlie spends a lot of time getting his students to memorize the proprietary colonies versus the royal colonies, and in Charlie's class they don't forget why they're doing this, because there is a reason for this. This does make some difference. But
yeah, we spent a couple weeks on that.
Yeah, that's good. I'm happy to hear that. If I had another son, I would definitely send him to St. John's. So you have Pennsylvania creating a new government in which the assembly, because it represents the people, has all the real power. And every man over the age of 21 will get to vote for members of this assembly, and they'll serve a one-year term. By the way, another bumper sticker you would have seen in this period is where annual elections end, tyranny begins. In Rhode Island, the legislature serves a 6-month term. But no law this Pennsylvania Assembly passed would take effect until there had been another election. So people will be able to say, we don't do like this, we don't like this, and then vote them out and get a new legislature in. There is an executive council that, because the assembly can't be in session constantly, so this executive council will be chosen by the assembly, and it will have a presiding officer, because the council needs that. The presiding officer, of course, is called the president, and his job is to preside over this council. And if something really important happens, they have to call the legislature back into session. So it's very democratic in that it's elected by a very broad suffrage, in fact, the widest suffrage of any state. And it has this assembly. It also has a Declaration of Rights. And most of these declarations of rights have the operative word is ought rather than shall, like liberty of the press ought to be protected. Liberty of conscience ought to be protected, and other things that the legislature ought or ought not to do. And so very wide suffrage, no real check on the assembly, because why do you need this? We've gotten rid of the bad checks, the king, the aristocracy, and the presumption then is that people are basically good and aren't going to do anything to hurt their neighbors. That's one model. And Adams sees things a bit differently. In fact, he said that the people of Pennsylvania will fall on their knees to the King of Great Britain, begging them to take him back under their protection from this Constitution. And in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts form the real poles in this. Massachusetts' Constitution is not that democratic. It does have a lower house, a legislature that is supposed to represent, the common people. If you pay a £3, if you let me see, it's like you have to have an estate worth £100 in order to serve in this assembly, and you have to have paid taxes. You have to have property to the amount of £3. It's about $40 to vote for them. And there's also a state senate that's supposed to protect property, because Adams sees the big breakdown in society is between rich people and people of more modest means, not rich and poor. That's a somewhat different formulation, but the really rich people and the rest of us. And Adams definitely was among the rest of us. And he knew that there needed to be a house in the legislature that would represent people of more means, because what's going to happen in Pennsylvania is people of more modest means have a majority. Why don't they just tax the rich? The people who have a lot of property, well, we can take some of it away from them, and then we won't have to pay anything. And this has some plausibility to it. I know there are a number of presidential candidates now advising something very similar to this. I've been able for years to teach this without anyone thinking I'm pointing a finger at any particular person or a group. Anyway, what happens in Pennsylvania is this. Yes, the majority in the assembly does try to tax the rich and take their property away. And even though the Pennsylvania Constitution says people's property ought not to be taken away unless we really need it for something. Pennsylvania did create a council of revision that'll meet every 7 years to determine whether the legislature's done anything it ought not to have done. So, for example, if Mr. Newhall's house had been taken away because he already has another house, in 7 years, you can go to the Council of Revision and say they really ought not to have done that, and then maybe they'll do something for you. Maybe not. It depends, I guess, on what they're feeling in 7 years, and you presumably have been able to get by for 7 years without the Council of Revision having to intercede. Massachusetts, and so Adams recognizes what's going to happen in Pennsylvania is this. I don't want to give away the answers here. Rich people typically will figure out a way to get the assembly to do what they want by, say, bribing members of the assembly or getting elected to the assembly themselves. And that's what happens in Pennsylvania. So you have every year the two sides fighting it out in the assembly, and it's somewhat chaotic. Adams thinks, well, if we separate these two, each will have a check on the other. And he says the great art of law giving is in balancing the rich against the poor in the legislative body so that neither one can control the other. And then making the executive and the legislative a perfect balance. So this system created in Massachusetts with two houses, one representing the people, the other representing property, and the executive and the legislature checking each other, and then an independent judiciary, which can do things like say, Mr. Jennison can't own Mr. Walker because it violates the Constitution. All of These checks are there for a reason. They're there to protect individual rights. And for Adams, as for Madison, they saw the real breakdown in society as between people and property, between rich people and not so rich people. You know, we see the breakdowns in lots of other ways, but the system they're created is really intended to protect these kinds of minority rights. This is what Madison's writing about in Federalist number 10 and then in Federalist 51, where and he also wrote a long memorandum on this in April of 1787, just talking about the breakdowns in society and all of these the multiplicity of interests that go into a society. And the prevailing thought among political theorists at the time was a small republic. The republic had to be small, where people would have a common interest. And Madison thought, well, there really is no such society like that. Like this, like right now, there are like 4 of us, and we all have different interests. And this is about as small a cohort as you can get. But we have very different interests. And Madison says you put 3 people in a situation where they have a different interest, 2 of them have a different interest from one, will that one be secure? Well, probably not. Well, if it's 3,000 and there are 2,000 versus 1,000, will the 1,000 be secure? Well, definitely not. So what Madison's proposal was to extend the sphere of the republic to create so that there's multiplicity of interests would check each other. So the real thing the Constitution does is try to check these different interests, or allow these different interests to check one another, so that ambition can check ambition. It's not, we're going to create a better kind of people now that we're done with the bad old king and aristocracy, but recognizing that these are inherent tendencies in everyone. This is yet another long sermon, which seems to have come out of some text which I've now forgotten, so I apologize. But you do see in this an attempt to protect individual liberty, not by saying no one's liberty should be constricted, but instead by giving people a voice and a role in this society and a check in the legislature, in the court, or in the executive.
As Bob said, I want this to be a dialogue. So with everybody here, feel free to jump in with comments, questions, words of wisdom. What I think the key is in constructing historical context is exactly what Bob was talking about. So in some ways, Bob, you've done it beautifully. You've given us a wide context, but then also taken us into individual stories and narratives of people and petitions, and I'm excited about some of the things you were saying, particularly the Kentish petition, the 1773 petition for liberty, Prince Hall, and then the Mashpee Wampanoag controversy in 1773. It seems to me those 3 things can go together in a nice coherent argument as you laid it out. And how would we then take something like that and see a context, an historical context that brings in other voices, Native American voices, English voices that are about representation, as well as African American voices, and now have these new voices to understand, or for our students to understand, the wider context. So the question then becomes, what do our students know? Where do we start? Some of our students, for me, for example, I have some students in my classroom who are Chinese. Mm-hmm. They know very little, if anything, about the American Revolution. Others of us have students who went through the school system here in elementary school or middle school, or their parents have taken them to lots of sites, and they know something about something. I don't know how much they know, or what their real understanding is. They tend to, I think, founder chic, if you will, is where most of the information they have, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's good to know about Jefferson and Madison and Washington and Adams, and I hope that we continue to do that in a rich way. But then the question becomes, how does uncovering these new narratives change our fundamental understanding of the revolution? And I think students, middle school, high school students, can get excited about that idea. That what role can they play in helping shape the narratives in the classroom, and how do they then walk out of that classroom or that course with a much richer understanding of what they see when they walk around Massachusetts or wherever they walk around in life.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm interested in thinking about together in this course over the course of these Wednesdays and in August is how, as teachers, we can empower students to do that. So whether it be, again, taking those, for example, those 3 documents you talked about, creating a document set, having students find those documents, having them excerpt them, having them maybe put them in sort of, curate them and put them in some sort of display. Working with them is going to make them understand them. Memorizing them, I hate to say it, is not a bad thing, but it's not really the goal. The goal is for them to understand them. You have to get them to that higher level.
Right.
And they'll learn what they are in the process. Bob, I didn't mean to stop you.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah.
And how do we do that around, for example, I think these key words that that you're proposing, that we talk about, or that the framers are certainly talking about: liberty, freedom, representation. Those words are good hooks for designing a lesson for students. Just simply to say, what did representation mean in a 18th century context, from Kentish all the way to the Mashpee Wampanoag?
Yeah. That's very good.
And how they understand representation today.
Yeah.
So, we're going through an election cycle. We're always going through an election cycle.
Yeah.
So yeah, if they can think about, do they know who their representatives are? What does it mean to have to be represented? So, and then to flip that right back to our course, how do we represent in our class as teachers this multiplicity of voices? Not that we have to be experts in all of them. Not that we have to know everything about. When I was reading an article last week thinking about this, about women in Georgia during the Revolution. I knew nothing about women in Georgia in specific. But suddenly, we don't have to know all that content. What we have to know is how to help students frame it and empower them to go find these things. And a lot of these things they're going to find are going to be dense, inaccessible. And then, when you have Kenneth Davis to help us explain it, and make it so clear, as you do in your book about Professor Davis, about the 5 African Americans who were owned by, there it is, in the Shadow of Liberty. I mean, that makes it really accessible for these guys and gals. And students suddenly see, okay, there's a different point of view. So I guess one of my goals with everybody this course will be to help me understand better, and me and everybody, how do we teach this stuff in a way that's substantive and rich?
Yeah.
Kids.
Plus, I also think, one of the fundamental for really understanding historical perspectives is looking at historical empathy, and getting students to really think about, and I think, like as Ray Raphael talked about, it was the stories, right?
Right.
Stories in terms of various individuals. And really, I think one of the bridges that we need to get to build for our students is having the notion of historical empathy, having students to realize that, because I think one of the challenges in classrooms and students today is having this sense of presentism when studying history. Don't really understand decisions and actions that were made 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And so I think that's one of the key things that students need to start to learn, especially when looking at artifacts and transcripts and speeches and so on and so forth, is to really get more into the minds of those who lived in that time period, rather than in incorporating their own sense of values and attitudes that they have today. So, and I think that's one of the difficulties in learning and appreciating history is not having that historical empathy. So I think that's one of the other key pieces that we need to keep in mind.
And one of the there are multiple ways of trying to get at that for students, and there are also pitfalls. There's been recent controversy or discussion about use of simulations in the classroom. They can be done very, very well. And I'm sure those of us who do them, I certainly have done them in the past and will continue. You have to be very sensitive and careful in how you do simulations. And but those tend to be things that my students walk away from and come back and tell me about when I'm interviewing them for College Recs. What did you remember from the class? Oh, I remembered this particular simulation. It cuts to them in a personal way. And yet we have to be careful with that. Meryl Kohlhofer, you know exactly what I'm talking about with what's going on with the idea of slavery in Boston in front of Faneuil Hall, and that controversy, which I'm sure happy to could tell us a lot more about. And yet also the idea of talking about being able to have people in the revolution who look somewhat like them. I, for example, have quite a few Latino students in my classroom, and they're really interested in knowing what the Hispanic role was in the American Revolution. Did they play a role? Yes, they did. What was that role? And they get really excited when they realize, okay, this wasn't just white English men in Boston or in Virginia or in Philadelphia arguing. Oh no, there were Latinos, and that was an important role. So there's another way of empathy. But then once they have that, then they can expand out. I think a Latino student, an African American student, can access what's going on with Jefferson, as well as I hope that my white Protestant or Catholic students who are very middle class can access what's going on with Sally Hemings to some way, in some way.
Yeah.
Not completely, but in some way.
All right,
Meryl, I don't want to. I know we're concerned about time, but I wonder, Meryl, could you say something about what's going on with Faneuil Hall and slavery and slave auctions?
Well, we've got one thing coming up with there's going to be an art installation just outside of Faneuil Hall, which is it's sort of going to be a representation that looks kind of like an auction block set into the stones right outside of Faneuil Hall. An interesting thing, because there was no auction block in Boston, as I can't remember who it was who wrote the wonderful article for the William and Mary Quarterly about slave advertisements in Boston, said Boston didn't have a slave market. All of Boston was a slave market. And we have the issue with the Coalition for New Democracy bringing up the question of should we change the name of Faneuil Hall because of the fact that Peter Faneuil himself was a slave owner and engaged in, he invested in at least one voyage to Africa. Very likely, also much more likely, is that he was part of the movement of enslaved people around, the Caribbean to the Americas and so on. They did a while ago. They did do a simulated slave auction outside of Faneuil Hall in the free speech area near the Samuel Adams statue. We hear about that a bit. We're lucky enough as the National Park Service in that we aren't directly part of the debate over renaming Faneuil Hall. We have actually created a set of signs, inside the Great Hall, talking about one of which talks about Peter Faneuil and Revolutionary era Boston and slavery as a way of bringing these things up. So right now, but we also get it. One thing that with both what Bob was saying, what you were saying, Obviously I'm in a different position because I don't have my students, as it were, for more than at most an hour.
That's a challenge. I think we lost Merrill there for a second. I think it's really interesting. Did we lose Merrill?
It seems like he stalled.
I think we did. But it's interesting. We'll be starting our course in person at the Royal House and Slave Quarters, which of course then points to the controversy that was going on a few years ago with Harvard Law School, and because the Isaac Royal House and a lot of the royal family had connection with a plantation in the West Indies where there was a rebellion. That's where a lot of the wealth came from, and some of that wealth, of course, went to the foundation of Harvard Law School, and there was a whole report about that. So when we get there, and when we're there, the people at the Isaac Royal House will be able to, and slave quarters, to help us understand that controversy. I'm sure Bob has things to say about that for sure. Maybe has read the report from Annette Gordon-Reed and about what exactly was determined, and how do we understand that in today's moment. And kids get excited about that. I had to do a documentary film on that 2 years ago, and I tell you, it just lit him on fire. He was so excited to go interview Harvard Law School students, and he was the expert, and they were not. It turned out.
Oh, interesting.
But there's been some real new awareness, I think, for example, in Alan Taylor's new book, American Revolutions, of the importance of African Americans and abolition as a main cause of the revolution.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, it really brings Boston even more to the forefront, as Boston was so central to the abolitionist movement in the antebellum America. It puts Boston National Historical Park in really a key position for that trajectory, which I think there's a new book on the history of Boston, a city on a hill, which I wonder if that might be a center to for a lot of our students anyway, thinking about Boston. That's all.
Yeah, you have, Jared Hardisty's book on freedom. I don't know if you're familiar with that, which focuses a lot on pre-revolutionary Boston. Yeah. There, which also does a lot.
Great.
And then, this is all great because, when we meet in August, I believe it's Monday, in the afternoon, our session on August 12th, we'll be doing a walking tour of the Boston Freedom Trail. And so we really delving into a lot more as we visit particular sites around Boston and on the eve of and during the American Revolution. So great. Excellent. Thank you.